Welcome to everyone joining. Okay, so we're recording. So hi everybody, and welcome to this IEL online forum on perspectives on grammatical change. So today we have three experts in this field of grammatical change who are going to give some talks about their research and their sort of thoughts on this general theme. Starting with Marianne Hundt from University of Zurich. We have Terttu Nevalainen from University of Helsinki, and then Joel Wallenberg from University of York, which is also where I'm zooming in from today. And we have Bernd Kortmann here, who's the president of IEL, who some of you will be familiar with, I'm sure. And we may have some other IEL committee members on the call as well. But it's really great to have everybody here. Thank you for joining. So after the talks, we'll then have a general sort of Q&A roundtable of questions, thoughts, discussion on the talks and the theme in general. So I have a few sort of prompts, but it's very much open to the audience. So if you have questions at that point or during the talk, feel free to put them in the chat. After the talks, I'll stop the recording, and then so you know that the Q&A bit is not recorded. So at that point, you're sort of welcome to use the raise hand, come on screen and ask a question in person if you'd like, or if you just want to put it in the chat, I can then relay it to the speakers. I think that's about it in terms of housekeeping things. So Marianne is going to be first up, so she can share screen and then take it away. So each speaker has a sort of maximum roughly 10 minutes, and then we'll have the discussion at the end of the three, or just themes from the three. Oh, you're muted, Marianne.
Unmuted now. Right, can you all see the screen?
Not yet.
Oops. That's weird because I shared it. Share. Now?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, right.
There you go. Yeah.
Okay, here we go. Thank you for inviting me to this forum and to speak about perspectives on grammatical change. And the angle that I've chosen for the discussion tonight is ongoing change, a topic that I've been involved in for most of my academic career. And the other angle is world Englishes. And I think that this allows us to approach grammatical change in English from interesting perspectives. I want to highlight a couple of shortcomings and areas that are, I think, in need of a fresh view. And I also want to outline a way in which the field of world English's grammatical change and world English's research could potentially progress. And I think that what I'm going to show you this evening is not just relevant for ongoing change in world Englishes, but has a broader relevance to understanding change in the past as well. Okay, so what kind of previous research into empirical research on ongoing change in English and in world Englishes is there? Well, essentially, early days saw a lot of elicitation data, and I listed a couple of early studies here where people used elicitation experiments to collect information on regional use of grammatical features. And vacuum time, for instance, is broader than just grammatical features, but these are a couple of studies that use this approach. And then since the 1990s, research into varieties of English is increasingly corpus-based, and that includes studies on ongoing change. People have used descriptive statistics initially and then change from descriptive to inferential modeling, and then increasingly also from monofactorial to multifactorial modeling across increasingly larger numbers and types of Englishes. And an even more recent change in the field has been that people, oops, that's converging, there's a G missing there, converging, they've sought to find converging evidence and have started to supplement corpus data with experimentation. But that is after you've done the corpus research, and you then try to confirm what you find on the basis of corpus data with experimentation, so rating experiments and stuff like that. People have also applied the apparent time approach to ice corpora to get evidence on ongoing change. A notable study in this area would be Hansen's study on modals from 2018. And we've also used simulation experiments to model factors and variation and change. Right, here are a couple of examples. Patterns that are found to vary across regional varieties. And this is really just a very, very small section. And I've listed them according to level of abstraction, starting with the most abstract types of constructions first. So tense and aspect, so preterite versus present perfect, defining relative clauses, he always paid the book that or which he ordered. That's something where there's also prescriptive influence, especially on American English. The mandative subjunctive would be another example that is relatively abstract. Irregular verb morphology, light verb constructions. And as we move down this list, we get more and more lexical. Concord with collective nouns, variable article use with institutional nouns, variable article use with single role predicates, and then individual verb complementation patterns. So protest and appeal, both adversative verbs. They protested against the Supreme Court's decision. She appealed against the ruling, where we then have interesting case studies because they're very different with respect to corpus frequency, protest being much more frequent than appealed, for instance. And there are other argument structure constructions that could be studied and have been studied. Right, I think there are a number of problems with previous research, including my own. One of the fundamental problems in diachronic research into world Englishes is that there is a lack of diachronic corpus data for most post-colonial Englishes. That's why a lot of the time synchronic data is used to study diachronic change. That is, for instance, the case in Hansen's paper, who uses the apparent time approach. There's also a mismatch, I think, between increasingly sophisticated statistical modeling and the theoretical models that people have used to model the relation between different kinds of world Englishes. So Schneider's dynamic model, for instance, or the epicenter hypothesis, or, for instance, Meyer's world system of Englishes. And what's often something that is either explicitly or implicitly part of these models is that there is some kind of norm that people orient towards. So norm orientation is an aspect of a lot of this research. So I see that there are problems with the models on the one hand, and the predictions that people derive from them or don't even bother to derive from them. So basically, the most simplistic, and I plead guilty to having taken this approach, the most simplistic approach is you take Schneider's dynamic model, classify or basically list as to which stage in the development the variety has been classified as, and then you try and find support for that classification from a single grammatical feature. Okay, so we can start seeing the problem with this kind of approach. We have a very complex socio-historical model on the one hand, and then we've got studies that look into one or at best several grammatical features, trying to prove Schneider. So that's why I thought at one point it would be necessary, or I thought it necessary to call out this problem of the gap between models and modeling. Gries et al. Blamed the models. It would certainly be useful if such models of world Englishes were formulated with a degree of precision that makes it more straightforward to arrive at falsifiable operationalizations to test their claims, not to mention predictions. And then Schneider himself, in a much earlier paper, had said, well, it's the researcher's duty to bring forward hypotheses to ask the right questions. And I somewhat flippantly in that 2021 paper said, what does the statistical modeling have to bring to the table with respect to the theoretical modeling? And then in a 2022 paper, Bernay, Gries, and Heller got back on paper somewhat polemically, claiming, and I quote, "It seems unclear what definitions of model and theory Hundt implies here, but it cannot be the notions of model and theory that form the basis of the social, behavioral, empirical sciences." And I think they got me wrong there, because the main issue that I tried to isolate in that 2021 paper was that there was a concern over different levels of granularity, very broad, all-encompassing models on the one hand, and very fine-grained, complex statistical modeling on the other hand. And it was difficult to see basically how those two things could be mapped onto each other. And the metaphor that I found for this was that Schneider's model basically looks at the complex history of fashion, so the deep history of fashion and development of fashions and exchanges on fashion on a global scale. And then what the statistical modeling does, it looks at different types of seams. Okay, what are the technical ways of putting two pieces of fabric together, right? That doesn't tell you anything about the history of fashion. Okay, so an example of how you can use Schneider's model to derive predictions comes from a recent book by Laporte, who predicts that Singaporean English would be the variety that has progressed furthest along the 5 stages of the model with respect to norm orientation and also usage. So on this basis, it would be the most different from British English, resulting following the predicted decline of linguistic behavior. And the problem is that corpus evidence shows Singaporean English to be much more similar to British English in many respects, and Hong Kong English and Indian English. So it's the exact opposite of what the model would predict. And I think there's a problem on the one hand with the model. I don't think the prediction was wrong, but there's something wrong with the model. So we need to think about the modeling. And there's also something wrong, I think, with the type of data that people have been using to try and test Schneider's model. So I think the model needs updating, and that's something that has been done. So rather than having a dichotomous view of norm orientation, a multi-normative view has been proposed, for instance, by Meyer and Daiba in a paper from 2022. And the other thing is that we need different types of evidence. Oops, sorry. We need to look at the speaker rather than at what we get when we look at corpus data. That's really aggregate behavior of a whole speech community. And we need to move towards trying to understand what speakers do and what norm orientation of individual speakers does. Whoops. And in order to figure out whether they're actually able to influence their behavior, we would also like to understand what they know about regional differences. So what is their metalinguistic awareness like? And that is something that has an impact on processing. And metalinguistic awareness is also shaped by factors like salience and frequency. And how can we find evidence of processing? Well, we use experimentation. And in terms of getting interesting data that will help us to move forward in the validation or testing of Schneider's model, for instance, we could introduce structural priming on the one hand, and we could also introduce attitudinal priming on the other hand, and then see how that affects usage of exactly the same speakers, rather than simply gathering information after it's been analyzed, after the community has been analyzed. So the big question is then, do individual speakers actually have control over the usage? Do they know anything about the features that differ regionally? And what is their norm orientation like? They may simply be accommodating on the basis of structural priming. It may have nothing to do with control over the features or any identity construction. Usage feeds back into regional preferences. So essentially what I'm saying that what we need is a view or data that connects these different types of evidence. Metalinguistic awareness, norm orientation, and what individual speakers actually do when they produce language. And that's where I think that we're moving towards a view of language variation and change that is more psycholinguistic. So we are taking priming and salience and frequency into account. And this is where I want to leave off, and I'm looking forward to your questions later on.
Thank you very much for a really interesting talk. So we're moving now from World Englishes to History of English with Terttu's next talk. And then, yeah, please think of questions as we go, and you can put them in the chat now if you have questions that come to mind straight away, and we'll address them in the Q&A at the end.
Marianne, could you finish sharing, because you know, Zoom is yeah, okay, so right. So replace current share. I try to do that. Okay, am I visible and am I audible? I hope I am. Okay, so thank you, Marianne. You made me really feel envious, because, of course, the history of English, you know, if you go back a few hundred years, you can't do experiments, I'm afraid. So my take on Claire's question is an introduction of a case study. And I hope that I'll address most of the issues that you asked us to address, Claire, by just discussing a very well-known story, but actually the other side of the story that rarely gets discussed in our research. So the complexity of a simple grammatical change, the story of verbal eth, not s. Well, first of all, let me just say that my view of grammar is a very broad one. So it includes, of course, it's not just syntax, but it's also morphology, and in this case, also phonology, and perhaps even semantics. So a very broad view that I'm applying here. And I'm taking a variationist perspective on grammatical change, a typical variationist perspective that I have been working on for a long time now. So it's based on alternative ways of saying the same thing. So the typical, present-day sociolinguistic view of linguistic variation. And it is, of course, something that many of us have used and vouched for, but of course there are problems here as well. But my case study, you know, that is a very simple looking change of morpheme replacement. S being replaced by S in the third person singular indicative. So the sun riseth, becoming the sun rises. And as to data, I'm using corpus data, and particularly the corpus that we have compiled here in Helsinki, the corpus of early English correspondence, which gives us access to individuals and groups and also regional variation within the limits of the people who knew how to write, basically, literacy. So here's some details. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with these facts. So it's actually a corpus that comes in different formats. First of all, there is the original version that I'll be discussing today, 2.5 million words, and covering the period from 1410 to 1681. Then there is an extension of this corpus until 1800, and also a supplement and 2 published versions. And I'm thanking the team who've been involved in this corpus building work. So So the idea was that, by compiling a corpus like this with individual writers and individual letters and a long time span, we could approach the issue of language change. So originally it was envisioned as a corpus to enable the study of language change over time. Okay, language change. The shape of change, of course, there's an idealized S-shaped curve that many of us are familiar with a slow beginning, the outgoing form being dominant, the beginning, then the incoming form picking up in mid-range, and finally the process tailing off and the incoming form now being dominant at the end. And I'm calling it the winner takes it all model. So we're only interested in the form that gets generalized and less interested in the forms that get replaced. Okay, so here you see the corpus that we have compiled and the information that we can retrieve from the corpus. And you can see that this replacement of TH by S seems to pattern pretty nicely along the S-curve model. Pretty nice, but not entirely. And it runs from the early 15th century until the end of the 17th century. So, okay, the winner takes it all. Well, the pattern becomes more obscure once we take regional diffusion into account. So as you can see, we have looked at different regions, the north, the capital, the court, and East Anglia or Norfolk. And of course, here we can see a very odd thing happening. The idealized shape proceeds regularly, whereas in our data, the different regional sections behave slightly differently. So what is going on here? The story, of course, of verbal S is one of regional diffusion, verbal S being a Northern English feature that spread to the south in the course of a couple of centuries. So I'm looking at the electronic atlas of late medieval English and showing how S dominated in the north, and in the south, in Midlands, we have S. So I'd like to propose that what we are seeing in the previous picture is two stories instead of just one. First of all, the southern form eth diffused from south to north. If we look at the 15th century until about the first decades of the 16th century, what we are seeing is actually that the varieties that we're looking at are converging on the use of eth. So, and this is, of course, a pattern we find in a number of changes going on in English at the time, that is actually the southern forms that get generalized. And this is what seems to be happening here as well, if we are to stop our time span at 1540. But that's not the end of it. Of course, as we know, S is generalized. So now here in this picture, we see how S is replacing eth from the beginning, from the early 16th century onwards. There are certain areas like East Anglia that are not really behaving, but I won't have time to go into that. Okay, so two changes instead of one. So the question now is, why wasn't the southern pattern generalized? I'm suggesting that we're dealing with a double variable, morphology and phonology. The diffusion of S was connected with the syncope of the unstressed form in the suffix. So S becoming S. And this syncope also diffused from the north southward. And we do have some metalinguistic evidence. I'm glad that, Marianne, you mentioned metalinguistic evidence. So, for instance, one of the commentators, 16th century commentators, William Bullocker, allows the use of S, just S, as a poetic contraction of eth. So that's how he sees it. And I've called this stylistic indexing of S. So there is contemporary evidence suggesting that people are aware of this, but of course, looked at it from different angles and didn't analyze it in terms of regional variation at all. Perhaps we'll have time to discuss the factors that might have led to this, but perhaps not. But anyway, so how do we know? There's some spelling evidence suggesting this kind of morphological, phonological, morphophonological variation. So in the early data, 15th century, early 16th century, we have forms like, in the first instance, also what appointment make it instead of maketh, thinketh, delivereth. So the spelling form may suggest this kind of variation. Then in the next century, we have saith, knoweth, and desires. But of course, spelling evidence, and especially the kind of spelling evidence that we have, is not really something to rely on, because there was no written norm in those days, and people wrote at very different levels of literacy and literacy skills. And but anyway, this can be sort of looked at, and perhaps some evidence may be drawn from evidence of this kind. So, of course, I'm accepting that it was actually a morphophonological change, but it's of course not the whole story. We ought to look at lexical diffusion as well. So in this diagram, I show the overall pattern, including most verbs, but excluding have and do, and this is actually hath, has. So these forms lagged behind when the overall pattern had run its course. This S form was only in mid-range by the end of the 17th century, when hath and doth dominated. So there's room for study or research on lexical diffusion. How did the suffix end up being used in all verbs? It certainly wasn't in these most frequent verbs at the same time as in the rest. It's not the whole story. Zooming out, looking at suffixal marking of subject-verb agreement in third person singular, and I'm here looking at Bernd's stuff. In fact, the Electronic World Atlas of Varieties of English, where we have variation regionally. At least in 3 respects. We have zero marking. This zero marking of the third person singular is very frequent in Creoles and in East Anglian English. So the red marking, red indicators here show a feature that is pervasive or obligatory in a particular variety. So you find that in mostly in Creoles, but also in some local varieties, the British Isles. This is not the only pattern. We might have agreement sensitive to subject type, the Northern subject rule, which occurs in Northern and Scottish English. I haven't got a picture of that because I thought I won't have time to discuss that. But anyway, so we ought to be aware of the fact that syntax might also have a role to play here, and what we are seeing might be zero, it might be a suffixal form, but it wasn't choice between the two that would be just a free choice, but it would be regulated by the subject type. And then we also have the suffix s generalized to all persons, and that is pervasive in Newfoundland English. So it's a really complex pattern if you extend it to the global scale, or at least regional scale. But just like Marianne, I'd like to end with an individual, Lady Catherine Parston, and I think she nicely summarizes the situation that we are finding historical data. So she's writing to her 14-year-old son in 1626, and here's a passage. The 14-year-old son William was studying at the University of Cambridge. In those days, of course, you studied university studies very early. So thy father remembers his love to thee, and take thy writing to him very kindly. Thy brother remember his lovingest love to thee. I thought to have written to Mr. Roberts this time, but this sudden journey of this messenger affordeth me not so much time. So what do we make of this? An individual in one letter to using the second person singular thou uses all three possible forms that we have discussed. So lots of work to be done on the individual level. So I've looked at the general level. So my conclusions are that grammatical change, the way I've defined it, is multi-layered. So morpheme replacements can be influenced by other processes such as lexical diffusion, phonological processes, and syntactic developments. And of course, they can be potentially impacted by language and dialect contact. We haven't had time to discuss that very much, but that, of course, is always in the picture. And as is clear, we have variable material and methodological access to these processes. The further back in time we go, the scarcer materials become, which means that we have an uneven distribution of written sources over time, which again then influences the different levels of realization. Perhaps we can discuss the aggregate community level and find a nice S-curve of change. Once we move over to regional and area levels, the S-curves might still be there, but not as neatly. Then approaching sociolinguistic variation, more variation comes in, and individual variation is really interesting. And of course, we are building on individual variation when we are looking at the aggregate community level. But if we are interested in the process itself, of course, we ought to reach out to the individuals. So I'd like to finish with the risk we are running. So thinking of the parable of the blind man and the elephant. So if we want to generalize just basic on the basis of part of the story, we might sort of end up saying that this is the whole story, the tusk is a whole story, or the tail is the whole story. And of course, then our change ends up looking like this. So our elephant is really a very weird creature. And I've written about this phenomenon from various perspectives in a book that Anna Mauranen and Svetlana Vechinikova edited in 2020. So if you want to know more about the various stages, and also the fact that the reason why this verbal S is so important is that people who are learning English find it a problematic feature in the English language. So I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. And yeah, and I think already I'm sure we're all seeing sort of commonalities across just the two presentations so far. And I think Joel will carry on with some of the things that have come up about data and changing the history of English as well. So yeah, Joel, if you want to share your screen, you can take it away.
Sure, yeah, I think I will pick up on some themes. Let's make sure I can. Now you should be seeing my slides. Yeah? Good.
Yeah, all
Okay.
good.
All right. I'll try and do this fast. So I've called this the relevance of language change and the irrelevance of subfields, which is slightly facetious, but one of the themes I want to bring out is that what people think of as different subfields are not necessarily different. And we can gain a lot by integrating perspectives. The relevance of language change in particular, I'm actually thinking of the relevance of variationist studies of language change. So what I'm going to talk about is, first, I'll talk about competing grammars and the constant rate effect, which in my mind is a way of saying that sociolinguistics, historical linguistics, theoretical linguistics, they're the same field, more or less. Could add in bilingualism if I really want to upset people. And I'll talk very briefly about some work I've been doing recently on information theory and language, particularly information uniformity. This is a functional consideration, which I think helps us understand language change right alongside things like syntactic considerations. So it's possible to have different perspectives all at the same time. At that point, it'll be time to conclude and mention some things for discussion. But I have loads of bonus material if it comes up. So we'll see. So what I want to start with is, in many ways, my intellectual grandfather, Bill Labov, who said that historical linguistics is making the best use of bad data, and really posed the question, I think, in many ways, can we learn anything about linguistic competence from free production data? I will poke at Chomsky for saying for many years that naturalistic production data is too noisy, too unreliable to use in order to test precise hypotheses about linguistic theory. Labov took a different view and showed that that's really not right. And actually agrees with Chomsky on many, many things, just not this one. So I'm not actually diametrically opposing these two, they are not. But in this particular respect, Labov created an advance in the field, perhaps I might say the greatest advance in the field that I know of, which is the idea that you can use pre-production statistical data to understand things about linguistic competence. Tony Kroc in 1989 showed that in historical written data, you can apply the same logic that Labov was doing for contemporary spoken data, and that even with considerable noise in historical written data, abstract parameters can show themselves in the frequencies of surface constructions during syntactic change. So you can see abstract syntactic parameters show up in noisy production data, even at a long time depth with long dead speakers. To do this sort of thing, to use data from language use, including historical data, you need the following, and this I steal from Tony Kroc, just basically wholesale. You need linking hypotheses first. You need a hypothesis that links linguistic theory to the quantitative patterns of language use. By finding clear quantitative predictions of hypotheses about linguistic structures. You need to somehow link your idea about linguistic structure to quantitative predictions in order to use quantitative data. Fair enough. The second thing you need is statistical reasoning, which is to say, you need to find patterns underlying the noise, right? So you need to be able to look at probabilistic data and model the patterns, allowing for a certain amount of noise. So two successful linking hypotheses are competing grammars and the constant rate hypothesis. So I'll do this. This will get less abstract in about 1 minute. So competing grammars, it's basically the idea that linguistic variation and bilingualism share something in common. You could say they're almost the same thing. If speakers can switch between languages, why not between sublanguages or between linguistic features, different versions of the same linguistic features? So this would be like two settings of a syntactic parameter. So like in the classic do support case, between V to T movement or lack of V to T movement, which would be do support, or two realizations of the same phoneme, which is something that shows up in much of sociophonetic work, which is actually even different realizations of the same allophone in that case. You could even have it for like, is the thing you insert in pauses when you're talking, is it or is it right? Alternating between these two things is a sort of tiny code switching. That is the idea behind competing grammars. And I would say that a concept like this is necessary for any description of a linguistic change in a categorical dimension, like a parameter. Anytime where one structure replaces another structure over time, or one thing replaces another over time, or speakers are alternating between one thing or another thing, right? We need to be able to talk about competition between two forms. Second linking hypothesis, the constant rate hypothesis. Now, mostly known as the constant rate effect because it's shown up so many times. The old linking hypothesis was from Bailey, the idea that the change in some linguistic features starts in a context, some particular context that favors the change, takes off, spreading very quickly in that first context, and then moves to others later on, spreading more slowly in the other ones. Kroc in 1989 showed that this was wrong. It was the Bailey's hypothesis was great because it was falsifiable, and then it was falsified. This is all we can hope for in science, right? This is our legacy, to be proven wrong. So the constant rate hypothesis showed that a change in a linguistic feature spreads at the same rate in all contexts where the feature occurs. And this turns out to be true for phonology as well. I won't say more about that because we'll move on to this very well-known case study, which is competing grammars and the constant rate effect in OV and VO. So we have some sentences from Middle English, from the Ormulum, which is one of my favorite texts. So we have an object-verb sentence. You might also a spiritual loaf prepare in 1. And in 2, we have a nice verb-object sentence. He may not rightly know me, as a verb-object sentence. And the structures for these two are below. I'm not saying loads about linguistic structure, but I will say that in order to do a corpus study of something like object-verb and verb-object, you cannot rely on the string orders alone. You must have a structural sense of what's going on in order to even know which objects to look at and compare to which other objects. So that is sort of inherent in what I'm saying. So there is linguistic theory involved, even though I'm not talking. There's syntactic theory involved, even though I'm not talking about that so much right now. I love this sentence. Anyone here who's heard me speak before has heard it. My father, this is another Middle English sentence. My father and my mother, because I would not you forsake, have forsaken me. This is this lovely little bilingualism in one parameter with the same words in the same sentence. One author switching between the two orders with the same words almost within the same sentence, just two clauses, right? So you forsake, thee forsake, have forsaken me. Right, so this is the competing grammars situation, which you can sort of see from individual sentences. You cannot see the constant rate effect from individual sentences. You need statistical data. So this is again the idea that if a change is in progress for a linguistic variable, it'll progress at the same rate in different contexts, but some contexts will favor one variable over the other without affecting the trajectory of the change. So this is the object-verb to verb-object change in English and Icelandic, object-verb going away. That's what the graph is showing. The pink is main clauses, the black is subordinate clauses. And what you see is subordinate clauses, for reasons that I don't think we know, favor object-verb more than main clauses, but the rate of change is the same in the two contexts. And it's the same in the two contexts in the two languages, which is quite fun to look at. So that's a constant rate effect, and it shows favoring of a form in a particular context. Claire, I swear I will finish up in about a minute. In addition to, like I said, the syntactic theory that's sort of involved in gathering the data, the understanding of competing grammars in mental, the linguistic competence, the sort of organization of language use in the mind, there is also functional considerations, communicative considerations that will help us understand the patterns we see in language change. And in particular, that favoring in different contexts. So the one I've been looking at recently is information uniformity. That's the header from a paper a few years ago with some collaborators. In short, speakers like to spread information across sentences if they can and not bunch it up. That's basically the idea. I will leave it there for the moment. And in the object, verb, and verb object change, you can actually see this show up because if you have a subject and object of the same type, like in the top left of this little schematic, pronoun subject, pronoun object, or nominal subject, nominal object, you can get a bunching of lots of information or not very much information if they're pronouns. And object verb might give you that bunching more than verb object if you look at the top right, where a verb gets stuck in between the subject and the object. There's other stuff in the sentences too, but I'm ignoring that for the moment. Okay. If you have arguments of different types, which is the bottom half of there, you actually get less of a bunching in the object verb order than in the verb object order. So that would actually mean that object verb is disfavored when subject and object of the same type. Object verb is favored a bit more when subject and object are different types. And then if you look in parsed corpora of historical English, from Old English to modern English, and you look at the effect of subject type and object type on the frequencies of object verb, and you see the decline in object verb order over the same period that we saw before. And now on the left side of this in English, you have nominal objects, and the blue line is where the subject is also a nominal. So that disfavors OV, blue line below the pink line where they're different types, where the arguments are different types. On the right side, if you have a pronominal object, the lines reverse beautifully because now the blue line is different types, which is better with OV, and the pink line is the same type, which is a little less good with OV. So now we have, in our competing grammar situation with a constant rate effect, we have a constant rate effect predicted by the argument types based on this sort of functional thing of speakers liking to smooth information across the sentence for ease of communication. I can get into why that is later. And we have a nice little reversal of our frequencies depending on which types you combine, which argument types you combine. This is actually the same thing in Icelandic, which lets us know this is a real thing. It's not just English, it's two languages. And I'm getting over time, so I have to finish. So conclusions are insights from sociolinguistics, which is where the statistical study sort of comes from originally. I will say, with the exception of some very interesting Swedish writing and speaking linguists in the 50s. I actually should give them credit. But besides them, the insight comes from sociolinguistics and the study of language change. They can actually improve our linguistic theory and our understanding of what speakers are doing when they speak. We can find some surprising results when we think to look and trust data from language use as being insightful for linguistic competence. Well, we have to trust it skeptically because there is noise in it. But when you model the noise, and when you model the pattern under the noise, you can find some interesting stuff. I should actually leave the other bits because they refer to bonus material, and I will leave us to discussion. So anyway, thanks for now. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Joel. So yeah, thank you all three speakers, and I'll stop the recording now as we move to the Q&A bit.